Hello. This time I'm going to read again from Terry Jones's Fairy Tales, and this story is called The Wooden City. Before I start, I must just say this one's for Dylan and Bella, because I know they've been waiting for some new stories for a few days now. The Wooden City. There was once a poor king. He had a threadbare robe and patches on his throne. The reason he was poor was that he gave away all his money to whomever needed it, for he cared for his people as if each of them was his own child. One day, however, a wizard came to the city while the king was away. The wizard summoned all the people into the main square and said to them, "Make me your king, and you shall have all the gold and silver you ever wanted." Now the townsfolk talked amongst themselves and said, "Our king is poor, for he has given all his money away. And while it is certainly true that there are no beggars in this kingdom, it is also true that none of us is very rich, nor can expect to be, as long as our king reigns." So at length they agreed that the wizard should become their king. "And will you obey my laws, whatever I decree?" cried the wizard. "If we can have all the gold and silver we ever wanted," they replied, "you may make what laws you wish." Whereupon the wizard climbed to the top of the tallest tower in the city. He took a live dove, tore out its feathers, and dropped them one by one out of the tower, chanting, "Gold and silver shall be yours, and blocks of wood shall serve my laws." Now that poor dove had as many feathers on its back as there were people in that city, and by the time the wizard had finished, everyone in the city had been turned to wood. When the king arrived back, he found the gates of the city shut and no one to open them. So he sent his servant to find out what was the matter. The servant returned, saying he could not find the gatekeeper, but only a wooden mannequin dressed in the gatekeeper's uniform standing in his place. At length, however, the gates were opened and the king went into the city. But instead of cheering crowds, he found only wooden people, each standing where they had been when the wizard cast his spell. There was a wooden shoemaker sitting working at a pair of new shoes. Outside the inn was a wooden innkeeper pouring some beer from a jug into the cup of an old wooden man. Wooden women were hanging baskets out of the windows or walking wooden children down the street. And at the fish shop, a wooden fishmonger stood by a slab of rotten fish. And when the king entered his palace, he even found his own wife and children were turned to wood. Filled with despair, he sat on the floor and wept. Whereupon the wizard appeared and said to the king, "Will you become my slave if I bring your people back to life?" And the king answered, "Nothing would be too much to ask. I would become your slave." And so the wizard set to work. He ordered a quantity of the finest wood and took the most delicate tools with golden screws and silver pins, and he made a little wooden heart that beat and pumped for everyone in the city. Then he placed one heart inside each of the wooden citizens and set it working. One by one, each citizen opened its eyes and looked stiffly around, while its wooden heart beat tunk-a-tunk, tunk-a-tunk, tunk-a-tunk. Then each wooden citizen moved a wooden leg and a wooden arm, and then one by one they started to go about their business as before, except stiffly and awkwardly, for they were still made of wood. Then the wizard appeared before the king and said, "Now you are my slave." "But," cried the king, "my people are still made of wood. You have not truly brought them back to life." "Enough life to work for me," cried the old wizard, and he ordered the wooden army to throw the king out of the city and bolt the gates. The king wandered through the world, begging for his food and seeking someone who could bring his subjects back to life. But he could find no one. In despair, he took work as a shepherd, minding sheep on a hill that overlooked the city, and there he would often stop travellers as they passed to and fro and ask them how it was in the great city. "It's fine," they would reply. "The citizens make wonderful clocks and magnificent clothes woven out of precious metals. and they sell these things cheaper than anywhere else on earth." One night, however, the king determined to see how things were for himself, so he crept down to the walls and climbed in through a secret window and went to the main square. There, an extraordinary sight met his eyes. Although it was the dead of night, each one of those wooden citizens was working as if it had been broad daylight. None of them spoke a word, however, and the only sound was the tunk-a-tunk, tunk-a-tunk, tunk-a-tunk of their wooden hearts beating in their wooden chests. The king ran from one to the other, saying, "Don't you remember me? I am your king." But they all just stared at him blankly and hurried on their way. At length the king saw his own daughter coming down the street, carrying a load of firewood for the wizard's fire. He caught hold of her and lifted her up and said, "Daughter, don't you remember me? Don't you remember you're a princess?" But his daughter looked at him and said, "I remember nothing, but I have gold and silver in my purse." So the king leapt onto a box in the main square and cried out, "You are all under the wizard's spell. Help me seize him and cast him out." But they all turned with blank faces and replied, "We have all the gold and silver we ever wanted. Why should we do anything?" Just then the wizard himself appeared on the steps of the palace, arrayed in a magnificent robe of gold and silver and carrying a flaming torch. "Aha!" he cried. "So you thought you'd undo my work, did you? Very well." And he raised his hands to cast a spell upon the king. But before he could utter a single word, the king seized the bundle of firewood that his daughter was carrying and hurled it at the wizard. At once the flame from the wizard's torch caught the wood, and the blazing pieces fell down around him in a circle of fire that swallowed him up. And as the fire raged, the spell began to lift. The king's daughter and all the others shivered, and the tunk-a-tunk, tunk-a-tunk, tunk-a-tunk of their wooden hearts changed to real heartbeats, and they each turned back into flesh and blood. And when they looked where the wizard had been, there, in his place, they found a molten heap of twisted gold and silver. This the king had raised up on a pedestal in the main square, and underneath he had written the words, "Whoever needs gold or silver may take from here." But do you know what? Not one of those townsfolk ever took a single scrap of it as long as they lived. I wonder if it's still there.